We're going to take a good look at the gates that I mentioned in chapter 40 and one or two other things as well. And I hope by the time the evening is finished, we will at least understand how the gates work and how they all fit together. And you'll see how we do that in a moment. This temple is a remarkable construction, to say the least. It's the house of prayer for all nations. It is also the place where the nations will go to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, Zechariah tells us, and that lasts a week. It's also a place, it becomes in effect the centre of world government, because this is where the point at which Christ and the saints will reign from. It's a place where people will go to learn of Christ and of his ways. In effect, it's a university as well on a grand scale. And so we begin perhaps to get the idea why it is such an enormous place. I'd just like to explain that most of what you're going to see on the screen this evening is really the work of Brother Henry Sully, who was an architect in Nottingham in the 19th century. But he was also, and more importantly, a brother in Christ. And Brother Sully and Brother Roberts, in effect, got together. It was Brother Roberts that encouraged Brother Sully, knowing that he was an architect, when they were both still in their 30s, to apply his mind to seeing if he could work out what these last chapters were. And it took him many years to do it, and they came to the end of the project, and then of course the next thing to do was to get the money for publishing, because there wasn't a CMPA in those days. If you wanted to publish a book, you've got to finance it yourself and then hope that the money came in, or you could do it by subscription. So they arranged for subscription and money came in, but not enough, and so the whole project was in danger of falling to the ground. And quite rightly, they decided to make it a matter of prayer. And they were almost on the point of giving up. And the right amount of money was laid in the hands of Brother Henry Sully, and they could go ahead with publication. Robert Roberts not only encouraged the whole project, but he proofread the work before it went into publication. So Robert Roberts was behind it all the while. And on the screen you can see part of a quotation from Robert Roberts, where he says that Brother Sully's studies led to a totally different view of the fabric seen in the vision by Ezekiel for many that have been previously entertained, different in magnitude, different in plan. We'll need out the next bit, but the bit in bold: such as it is not a guess, it's not a theory. It is the outcome of the divine specification studied and construed with filial and scrupulous subserviency, with most painstaking and prolonged application. And Brother Sully himself, as I said, I think it took 7 years to do, in almost constant application. He did hundreds of diagrams which he cast on one side because they didn't quite work, and eventually came to the diagrams, some of which we will see this evening, God willing. So please, it's not my work. It's the work of what I regarded as a young brother many years ago. Well, we'll start from the bigger picture and work our way in. Can we go to Ezekiel 48 first of all? And we'll just quickly glance down the verses, and we can see that the end of verse 1 and down to verse 7, there are 7 tribes mentioned, starting with Dan and finishing with Judah. Then there's a break, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And in verse 23, you see the other 5 tribes. So that Benjamin is close to the middle, working our way down to Gad at the bottom, which is roughly what we see on the screen there. You may be able to see on the screen that there is a dotted line showing an eastern border dotted with a question mark. Where the eastern border isn't defined. We know the north, we know the south. I was going to say, obviously the west is on the coast, but bear in mind that there are huge geographical changes to take place as a result of the earthquake. So it doesn't follow that the coast is going to stay where it is, but that's another story. The diagram, as you can see, shows that these tribal areas going off to the east. How far to the east is an interesting question. The land that was promised to Abraham, of course, was the land between the two great rivers, between the Nile and the Euphrates. And I would suggest, you can discuss this afterwards, that really it is the whole of that land between those two rivers that is implied as being the area given to Abraham and his sons in the age to come. It's not just the little bit that we now know as the land of Israel. So we now want to move in a little bit closer and have a look at the Holy Oblation, which was the bit that we missed out in the middle of chapter 48. The oblation itself is in the middle. There were 7 tribes, you may remember, to the north and 5 to the south, and in between of those is this Holy Oblation, which is a square zone in the middle there, and we'll come and look at that in a little more detail in a moment. And you'll see there's an area to the east and to the west of that square, which we'll also have a look at. So that square area is the one that we just looked at. Ignore that London to Brighton, I meant to change that, it's quite wrong. It's only one section that's 22 miles. It's about 56 miles square is that whole Holy Oblation. And coming... if we just look at where this is described, we're in chapter 48, so have a look at verse 10 of chapter 48, and we'll start at verse 8. By the border of Judah, from the east to the west side, shall be the offering which you shall offer, 25,000 reeds in breadth and in length, as one of the other parts. So it goes all the way from east to west, however long that is, and it's 25,000 east and west from top to bottom, from north to south, for the oblation itself. And it's split into 3 zones. There's a 10, a 10 and a 5 as you go from north to south, and those are described as being for the sons of Zadok. If you look in verse 11, the top section there is for the priests that are sanctified of the sons of Zadok. Then in verse 12 describes a section for the Levites, and then the bottom section in verse 16 there is verse 15, the 5,000 that are left, which is the green bit at the bottom, is for the city, although it doesn't occupy all of that area. And so, just very quickly, we've seen this Holy Oblation divided into 3. And the Holy Oblation contains within it the city. The bottom section, I said, was described as the portion for the city, and the city is within that zone, and it's not to be confused with Jerusalem. If you look between the top section and the pink section, roughly in the middle, you'll see where Jerusalem is located. So we're way to the south, as you can see by the position of the Dead Sea. And there is Yahweh Shema. Chapter 48 and verse 35, the very last verse. The city is called, right at the end, Yahweh is there. If you have a margin, it will say Yahweh Shema. It would better be rendered, well, it is Yahweh is there, or yonder. Not to be confused with Yahweh's here. It's Yahweh's there. And it's almost like a giant signpost that says that Yahweh is way to the north in Jerusalem. So that is the location, there we are, of Yahweh Shema. It's a big city. And just to get how big this whole thing is, there we are, the temple is quite some way away. from Yahweh Shema, 20 odd miles. And just to get a grip of Yahweh Shema, it would fit inside the motorways that surround Birmingham. So next time you're stuck on the M42, just think that you're on the edge of Yahweh Shema and it might cheer you up. So coming back then to the Holy Oblation, we have this square area which is the Holy Oblation, but then we saw that little sort of triangular bit on the west, and however far it goes off to the east. Well, what's all that about then? Well, chapter 48 and verses 18 and 19, we find there the residue. So it's what's left of this whole section. We've got the city, the square, what's left to the left and the right. The residue in the length over against the oblation on the holy portion shall be 10,000 eastward and 10,000 westward, and it shall be over against the oblation of the holy portion, and the increase thereof shall be the food unto them that serve the city. So, and they that serve the city shall serve it out of the tribes of Israel. So we now know this whole zone to the east and to the west is essentially farmland. It will produce food for those who work in the city. So now we know exactly what it's for. So we've now got two other zones. So those are for the bits, I misled you, it's to the left and the right, the east and the west of the city itself is for the farm areas. The rest of the Holy Oblation, chapter 46, verse 16. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, if the prince give a gift to any of his sons, the inheritance thereof shall be to his sons, it shall be their possession by inheritance. But if he give a gift of his inheritance to one of his servants, then it shall be his to the year of liberty, and it shall return to the prince, but the inheritance shall be his sons for them. Moreover, the prince shall not take of the people's inheritance, so it's not to the tribes to the north and the south. He shall give of his sons out of his own possession, that my people shall not be scattered. And that's the area to the east and to the west, however far to the east it goes. So we now know what all of these zones are for. So we now want to come on to the temple itself. Can we go to chapter 40 and verse 1, where we read of the 25th year of our captivity and the beginning of the year, 10th month and so on. And in verse 2, we read that he was in the visions of God. He brought him into the land to a very high mountain, and by which was as the frame of a city on the south. I just want to concentrate on that expression, a frame of a city. And I've even heard it suggested that, well, Ezekiel didn't really know what a city was. We know what cities are, but Ezekiel didn't know what a city was. Ezekiel was in Babylon, of course he knew what a city was. Nonsense. So just that very expression, the frame of a city, you can see how the diagram that is on the screen fits that description. So could any other diagram, provided two things. There's a frame of a city. It's not completely built in like our cities, it's a framework, and it is sufficiently large to be described as a city. Skip over that. Again, just a different perspective. Notice on the left hand side, which could either be the north or the south, you see a river, and that river gives us some important clues which we'll look at in a moment. If you just look over on the right hand side, you'll see another river. So there are two rivers picked up elsewhere in Scripture, but we'll leave that on one side. What's this city going to be made of? We aren't actually told, is the simple answer. So feel free to completely disagree. But that's the colour of the stone that's already there, of course. The lower part of those stones, and the stones way below ground, what is now ground level, are Solomon's stones, and they are huge. And then the slightly smaller ones above were put there in Herod's time, and the rubbish at the top is Arabic. But the point that I want to make is it's a white stone, and personally I'm convinced that Ezekiel's temple will be made out of white stone. You see in some of the diagrams it's all coloured in brown. I don't think it'll be brown at all. I think it'll be white. Can't prove a word of what I've just said, but it's interesting anyway. Can we go to chapter 42, please? We've said it's the frame of a city, and I just want to concentrate for a minute on the overall size, because it is a subject of some dispute. Chapter 42 and verse 16. He measured on the east side with the measuring reed 500 reeds with the measuring reed round about. Now 3 times in that verse we're told the measurement is reeds. Some modern versions put cubits in there, which reduces each measurement 12-fold. So if you change your reeds to a cubit, you end up with a small temple. I've already indicated some of the things which are going to go on in that temple, and just in case we didn't catch it in verse 16, it's repeated in verse 17, and again in verse 18, and again in verse 19. We can't miss the point. 4 verses, one after the other, 3 times in each verse we're told the measuring unit is the reed, and it's 500 reeds. Can we just accept what Scripture says? That's how big it is. And without stopping to do the maths, that's where we get the expression that Ezekiel's temple is a mile square. It's just over a mile square, but that's the rough size of it. So a few more, another clue then about the size. You notice that river that we mentioned before? It was on the left and the right of the diagram. It's actually on the north and the south of the temple. And you might be able to just make out at the bottom of that diagram the river, and sort of at the top of the diagram you can see it going off to the right hand side there. Now how does that help? Well, there's the river. Can we go to chapter 47? And verse 3. And the man that had the line in his hand went forth eastward, and he measured 1,000 cubits, and those are cubits, and he brought me through the waters, and the waters were to the ankles. So the first 1,000 cubits is water you can go through because it's only ankle deep. Then in verse 4, a similar description, but it's to the knees. Then verse 4 again, and it's to the loins. So this river is getting deeper and deeper. And then there's another section beyond where it gets deeper still. It couldn't be crossed. And that's interesting because it tells us that the waters can be crossed in line with the temple itself, but not to the east. And the east gate is for Christ and the saints, but we may or may not get there this evening. Now, why does a river get deeper and deeper? The answer is because there are tributaries. And the water comes from under the threshold. Chapter 47 and verse 1. He brought me to the gate, to the door of the house, and behold, the waters issued out from under the threshold of the house eastward, for the forefront of the house was toward the east, and the waters came down from under the right side of the house at the south side of the altar. And then we read that the waters come out in verse 2, and then he measured it again that we've just read. And the waters come out under the threshold we saw in verse 1. Where is the threshold of any building? And the answer is that the threshold is where the door is. As you walk through a doorway, the part of the floor that you walk across is the threshold. And so it's where the wall would be if the door wasn't there. Let's think about thresholds first of all then. The threshold, as we said, is the place where the door is. And we've just seen in verse 1 that the waters come from under the threshold, which on the face of it is extremely unlikely. You would never think of putting waters there. So people are able, by some means, to come up to the doorway and get through the doorway, or the gateway, which we'll look at in a moment, but underneath there, and then presumably coming out a little way on, is where the waters come out. Now, if these waters, or the river alongside, gets deeper and deeper and deeper, that tells us that there are a number of thresholds for the waters to come out. That suggests to us that, therefore, there are a number of gates. How many gates? Open perhaps a little bit to query. I think there's actually one more that Brother Sully has, but we'll gloss over that particular detail. So just bear in mind then that this water comes out from under the altar, it comes down the side of the hill, and it goes out at the thresholds to the north and to the south, but not to the east and to the west. We've really simply made the point that the waters get deeper because they come out from underneath the thresholds. And there are a number of gates, and that's where the waters come from. Now, those little gaps that you can see in the horizontal and the vertical lines, which I've highlighted there with a red arrow, those are the gates. And from where you're looking at there, they seem pretty small. But each side of those gates, you could comfortably get a house in either side. That's how big they are. And what we're now going to do is have a look at these gates in particular. And the first thing we're going to do, remember, you can see the arrow is deliberately looking on one side at an angle. And so looking at just one of these gates, that's the area of the gate. And there's one or two things we'd like to point out. You can see through the middle of that gate a series of pillars. Remember those pillars because we'll pick those up later. You might be able to pick out that in front, just about, you can maybe pick out the steps going up to the gateway. And if you look to the left and the right of the gateway, you can see 4 blocks of stone, assuming they are stone, which may or may not be in exactly that position, but they will be somewhere near there. I would point out that as we approach the temple, if we're blessed with being in the kingdom, whoever goes and approaches this temple, what they won't see is what you can see on screen. Because what's been left off is the outer coverings, so that we can see inside the temple. As you look above where I've got the red line, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 pillars, and those massive pillars have bases. Remember those, because we're going to come to look at those in a moment, and they'll be on the left hand side and the right hand side. And again, to the left and the right of the entrance, the first thing as you go across up the steps, to the left and the right there's a big wall. Remember that, because we'll come across that again in a moment. So we're looking there on an angle at the gate. I promise you this is the only clip art you'll see this afternoon. Just think for a moment, if I was to ask you to draw the floor plan of the chair that you're sitting on, what would you do? Think about it. Would you end up with... Go away. that. Because that's the floor plan of the chair you're sitting on an angle, to match the chair above. The simple point I'm trying to make, that may be obvious or it may be helpful, I'm just trying to point out that all we're going to look at for the next few minutes is a floor plan. It tells us nothing about height, nothing about construction materials or about colour. It just tells us what happens where the walls touch the floor. So a floor plan of this room would be more or less rectangular line, and that'd be it. And I just thought I'd take a little bit of time to just emphasise what a floor plan is. It tells us a lot, but on the other hand, it leaves out quite a lot. Now, you may have, I hope you've all got a piece of paper that looks something like that. Sorry? Okay, thank you. What I'm going to ask you to do, or encourage you to do, is we're going to end up with a diagram that looks like that. But we're going to take it slowly. If you want to build it up line by line on the sheet of paper that you've got in front of you, by the time we've finished, you will understand most of Ezekiel chapter 40. So I believe it's well worth doing. It's straightforward. First time I tried this with our young people, there was a 12-year-old in the room and she followed it, so no excuses. On the other hand, if you just want to sit and watch, that's entirely up to you. So, that's our starting point then. Remember that big thick wall we saw just at the top of the steps? Just at the bottom there, incidentally, those lines that go horizontal left and right and then turn up, that's the plan view looking down on the steps. And then if we go back to chapter 40 and verse 5, the first thing he saw was a wall. Now, that's not unreasonable. If you look at the houses opposite, supposing you've never been in a house before and you look at the house opposite, what's the first thing you see? It's a wall. It doesn't mean it's a garden wall with something behind it, because some have said, yes, these overall dimensions of Ezekiel temple are like a surrounding wall and then got a little temple in the middle. That's not what Ezekiel saw. He first of all went and he saw the outside wall of the temple. It's in verse 5 and it comes on both sides. The bit in the middle marked C and B would be the threshold, and it's underneath those steps that the waters come out of. So we need a distance for those, and in verse 5 we see there that he measured a wall on the outside of the house round about, in the man's hand a measuring reed of 6 cubits long and a cubit in the breadth. So he measured the breadth of the building. That's the first bit that he measured, 1 reed. Now we've just been told in that verse that 1 reed is 6 cubits, so we're going to do cubits all the way for the time being. So we know that that's 6 cubits rather from verse 5, and indeed from verse 6. He measured another wall, so there's one on the left and the one on the right. He's still standing at the threshold. The thresholds are mentioned in verse 6. He came to the gate that looketh toward the east, and he went up the stairs thereof, and he measured the threshold of the gate, which was 1 reed broad. So the threshold is the same width as the wall. That's exactly what you'd expect. So he's got 2 thresholds in verse 6. There's one threshold and another threshold, either side of those pillars that I asked you to remember, going straight up the middle. So there's then measured, I'll just put these in quickly, verse 7 and verse 10. There are chambers, little chambers, 1 reed long and 1 reed broad. Now at that point we're not told how many there are, but we know there's more than one because it's plural. And we're also told there's a space between the chambers of 5 cubits. and then he goes to another threshold by the porch. But if we look at verse 10, the little chambers of the gate eastward were 3 on this side and 3 on that side, and they're all the same. So we've got 3 little chambers, 1, 2 and 3 on the left hand side and on the right hand side. We know they're all the same size, and we know that they're all 6 cubits, because we were told that in verse 7. And now we know if there's 3 little chambers, there must be 2 spaces in between. So we can put that in as well. So we've got 5 cubits in verse 7, and again 5 cubits in verse 7. So most of the information, in fact, is in verse 7 and in verse 10. So we then come to the threshold by the porch, which is still in verse 7. Now, we've not had a porch before, so he's worked his way through. He's gone up the steps, he's looked at the outside wall, he's looked at the little chambers and the space in between, he's worked his way through, he's seen there's 3 chambers, and now he's come through the gateway, and he's come to a similar arrangement, but now he's gone to the area called the porch. And the thresholds, which is by the porch, is the outside wall, which is in verse 8. And he measured the porch of the gate within 1 reed, and that's the reed where the wall is against the porch. Incidentally, many of us may have a porch at home, and it may be about 6 feet square, and it just protects the front door, and that's probably about it. This porch runs the entire length, east and west, north and south. Once we've gone through that building, as we go there from east to west or from north to south, so it's about 1 mile long is this porch. It goes all the way across, and so we'll see how big it is. We're seeing from verse 8, that was the porch. Then we have the porch itself. Now verse 9 tells 8 cubits. He measured also the porch of the gate within 1 reed, and he measured the porch of the gate 8 cubits, and the posts thereof were 2 cubits. So we've got right at the top, letter J, you may be able to see are the porches, and I think these are going to come in. There we are. Those pillars are just 2 cubits, and that's also in verse 9. The posts thereof were 2 cubits, and the porch of the house was toward the gate eastward. So the porch is having gone through this building. It's not obvious from that diagram, but remember that those long horizontal and vertical buildings, they are either side of these gates. So what this gate does is go through the building and then come out the other side into the outer court, but more of that anon. Just to finish this off, in verse 11 we were told, verse 11 we're told there are 10 cubits, and in verse 11 he measured the breadth of the entry of the gate, 10 cubits. So we know it's 10 cubits, and it's 10 cubits both sides. And in verse 12 we have a space left, and there's a cubit space. And in verse 16 they're described as narrow windows, and there's some dispute as to just what those might be. But it divides off the little chamber from the main entryway going through the gateway. So the way through into these little chambers isn't from the gateway that we've just been looking at. You have to go into the building and come back in, unless there is a door that's not described, but be that as it may. So lots of these little chambers, little spaces, and I'm going to just fill them in fairly quickly. As we said, they divide off the thoroughfare, so to speak, from these little chambers themselves. we're not told what these little chambers are for. So feel free to speculate yourself as to what they are. So in verse 13, we read that he measured the gate from the roof of one little chamber to the roof of the other, and the breadth was 25 cubits, door against door. So there's a clue that that space we've just mentioned might contain a door. But we're told it's 25 cubits. Let's just stop there for a moment. So we've got 25. We know that either side of the pillars is 10. So that gives us 5 cubits in the middle for the central pillars that we saw on the elevation drawing. So it begins to fit together. Now, wouldn't it be nice if we could just establish that at least the length that we've got shown there, going from the top to the bottom of the diagram, does actually work? Well, if you go to verse 15, you'll see there right at the end of the verse it tells us it's 50 cubits. And if you add up all those cubits, those 6s and 5s and 2s and 8s, you will not be surprised to discover it comes to 50 cubits. And so that gives us some measure of certainty that what is there is correct. And we've looked at most of the detail for the first few verses, and if you look through, just glance through the rest of chapter 41 up to about verse 31 or so, you will find that the description just keeps repeating. So whether it's a gate on the outside or the inside, I'll come and explain that in a minute. It doesn't make any difference. Whichever gate you go in, they're all the same. And so we now have an understanding of pretty much the whole of Ezekiel chapter 40. Just from those really 4 or 5 verses. And wasn't that complicated really, was it? So, skip over that. The tables. Can we go to chapter 40 and verse 38? Chapter 40 and verse 38. The chambers and the entries thereof were by the posts of the gates, where they washed the burnt offering. And in the porch of the gate were 2 tables this side, 2 tables that side, to slay thereon the burnt offering, the sin offering, and the trespass offering. So the gates that I mentioned are in the porch, we saw in verse 39. And they are there. So you go through the gate, and then having gone through the gate is the place where these animals are slain. And then there are 4 tables on the outside. Remember those blocks that we saw either side of the steps? Well, they're now mentioned. They're described as tables for sacrificial use. Notice it's on the north side. These tables aren't described on any other side, only on the north. And that suggests that if you go to make an animal sacrifice, you've got to go in the north side. If you go in for some other purpose, you'll go in on the south side. But we'll see that in a minute. We're running ahead a little bit. So there we are, verse 9. Chapter 46 and verse 9 tells us that the people of the land shall come before Yahweh in the solemn feasts. He that entereth in by the way of the north gate to worship shall go out by the way of the south, and then vice versa. So if you go to the north, you can't go back out to the north. You can only go one way. So there's a one-way system. And maybe that's why there's pillars in the middle. Because there were people going in, and there will be people coming out. And whichever way you went in, you come out, you keep going in the same direction. Exactly why, you can ponder. But only described on the north gate, as we suggested, so only sacrificial arrangements on the north. Chapter 4. Now, I just want to just glance through chapter 40. I'm not going to go through these verses. I want to go through this bit fairly quickly, just to follow where Ezekiel went when he looked at all of these gates. It's quite interesting. He first of all went to the east gate. on the outer court. He then went to the north gate, outer court. He then went all the way down to the south gate, outer court. He then goes inside to another set of gates, another set of buildings which are absolutely identical. So there's two parallel lines of buildings, and the space between those parallel lines is the outer court. The square within those parallel lines of buildings is the inner court. And so, having seen on the south side, he then goes to the east, so he works his way back around the building, and he goes to the north south. So we can see exactly where he went, and you will notice he didn't go onto the west side. I believe he did that because there were no gates there, and I don't think there will be any gates on the west. There's no point. Take that diagram as you will. Personally, I think if the gates are there, I think they'll be blocked off, but that's me speculating. Why? Well, we've already seen that if you go into the north, you come out at the south, and vice versa. We haven't seen yet that the east side is entirely for Christ and the saints. That doesn't leave anybody else, so why would you want an east? And as traditional with scriptural things, the east is the back, isn't it? So, the east is the front and the west is the back. So this outer court then, between the two parallel lines of building, what we're looking at is a cross section. If you look at the left hand corner of that diagram, right over there, you see the table that we mentioned before, and those are the steps that go up. These zones here, coloured in green, are the little chambers. Those two zones in between are the spaces between the chambers. And as we're looking at the cross-section, we can see that those in fact have the pillars above. And that's why the wall that he first mentioned was so thick, because it's got these huge pillars on top, taking a massive structure. And a bit of a cavity wall just doesn't do the job. So we have this space in between, which is 100 cubits. And you can see the verses where that is referred to. And so that space in between then, as a perspective, looks like that. Again, remember, the outer coverings have been left off so you can see inside. And there's that corner tower right at the far end. And what you see there is the outer court. So the one side or the other would then become the inner court after you'd gone through the buildings. So just how big is this space, this outer court? Just try and get something in our minds to fix how far apart these buildings are. Well, it's enough to get a motorway and the verge and the hedge and whatever and the fence either side. All of that would fit in between, and we can prove that. There it is. So again, next time you're stuck on the motorway, just think, well, we could have Ezekiel's temple either side here, and it would just fit in. So, coming back then to this outer court, and to this corner court, which we'll perhaps describe in a little while, but just how big is this corner court? We're told the sizes, we'll skip over the sizes. But let's look at chapter 46 and verse 22, because that is fascinating. Chapter 26 and verse 22, in the four corners of the court there were courts joined or enclosed, or as your margin might say, made with chimneys. Now, isn't that interesting? Made with chimneys. And verse 23 says, there was a row of building about in them, about the four, and it was made with boiling places under the rows round about. And these are the places of them that boil, where the ministers of the house shall boil the sacrifice of the people. So as we know, under the law, certain sacrifices were offered and consumed on the altar. Other parts of the sacrifices could be used, particularly by the priests. But all these vast sacrifices that are going to be brought will also provide food for the people that are there. But just how big then are these corner courts? It only looks there as it's 5 stories high. But we didn't look at the dimensions. We can look at those afterwards if anybody wants to. But just to give us on the same scale, they're 48 stories high in the stories that we have today. So they are quite massive, these corner courts. So we've gone through fairly quickly. I hope we've now got a grasp of 2 things really: the overall size, the gates, and the point that I intended to mention when we're looking at the gates and the sacrificial arrangements. Can we take it on board that there will be animal sacrifice in the kingdom? Zechariah 14 tells us without any doubt that the Feast of Tabernacles will be kept. And if you look at the law for the Feast of Tabernacles, there were many, many sacrifices made each day on the Feast of Tabernacles. So we know that Tabernacles is going to be kept. We know that there are sacrificial arrangements. We know there is an altar, which we haven't looked at tonight, and we haven't looked at the circular buildings, I know. Some say, well, I don't understand why the sacrifice. Didn't the sacrifice of Christ do away with all of that kind of thing? So therefore they can't possibly be sacrificing the kingdom. Can we start from the point that we've already seen a scripture here, and I've referred to Zechariah 14, and there are many other scriptures that tell us that there will be sacrifice in the kingdom. Whether we can explain it to ourselves and whether we can work through the logic is another matter altogether. But can we please not start from the fact that says, I don't think there's going to be animal sacrifices in the kingdom, therefore there isn't any. Start from scripture which says there will be, and then work out why. And just briefly, why will there be sacrifice in the kingdom? Well, the answer is for exactly the same purpose as there was when the animal sacrifices were first introduced. They were to emphasise the sinful nature of the people that were offering those sacrifices and the fact that they were worthy of death. They were there to emphasise the holiness of Yahweh, and they taught about Christ. Let's take ourselves to the age to come. Millions of people have been told they've got to go to Jerusalem, Zechariah 14 again. Many of them willing to go, Isaiah 2 and Malachi 4. They want to go to learn of God and of His ways, and they're going to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, so they'll be there for quite a while, and they'll go back to their homes. And the person that's controlling all this, and the person that has wiped out all the world's armies, and has dismissed all the world's governments, he's sat there in Jerusalem, governing the whole world, and they're all thinking to themselves, who is this man? What gives him the right to sit there and make worldwide laws, to dismiss our democratically elected governments? Who is this man, Jesus Christ? The answer is in the law. So whereas the law for the children of Israel looked forward, exactly the same law will teach exactly the same things about exactly the same person, only on a worldwide scale, for all these people coming up to Jerusalem to worship at this wonderful place. So I hope we've helped a little bit. I know there's lots that we haven't looked at, and we perhaps discuss that afterwards if anybody wants to. But as I said, I hope we've at least got a good idea in our mind now of what this temple is about, and we hope above all that we can keep this vision in our minds. Even if the detail isn't right, even if it's not exactly that shape, let's keep a vision of something. Let's keep the vision of the kingdom before us. Without the vision, the people perish. And let's concentrate on the fact, brothers and sisters, that the kingdom is coming. Christ is going to return. And above all, that should reflect in the way we live our lives.